one element of the strategy is working through our managers, right? And our managers get to be not passive allies, because I make a distinction between active allies and passive allies. We've got a whole lot of great passive allies in organizations that are wanting to do something and they're like, but I don't know what to do, right? So active allyship can be facilitated through manager and management development, right? Managers all need management development, right? So organizations, if you're listening and you don't have a management development program, then that is a huge disservice to your managers right there. So we know that managers automatically need to upskill themselves to be more effective in being managers. So what I'm suggesting is DEI just becomes a way to pivot management development. It's not changing it, right? That's why it's the ABCs.
Welcome to ABCDEI, a podcast that explores topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion through stories of distinct and powerful lived experiences.
If you are tired of the preaching, shaming, and theory about why inclusion matters and just want to create change already, then you're in the right place.
Join us as we unlearn bias one alphabet at a time. My name is Susan Diaz.
And I'm Rohini Mukherjee.
Hello and welcome back to ABCDEI. Today we have a guest with us to chat about some things which I can only call like serendipitous sort of Venn diagram crossing on a few levels. So we'll probably dive straight into it, Rohini. Welcome to Martine Kalaw, CEO and founder and author. And we're going to tell you the story about what her book is called in a second. But first, welcome, Martine.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here with the both of you.
Nice to have you on the show.
Yeah. So let's start with the name of the book. So you've got a book, and the book is called The ABCs of Diversity.
Yes. Absolutely. And I was almost going to call it, I think originally I really wanted to call it the ABCs of DEI. And my only reservation was 6-7 months ago. I wasn't sure how familiar people were with the term DEI. I think now it's more widespread, but we were right on the same, wavelength.
We really were. And, with DEI, it's still, there's so many sort of variations of it, right? It's D and I, and it's EDI. And really I see what you're saying there. For us, it was really, I loved the alphabet play, and Rohini and I would have talked for a decade about stories involving, equity. And we were like, you know what, this is it. This is the podcast. Let's just make it happen. And so that's where we went with it. So maybe we'll start with your story. We're big on lived experience around here, and we really wanted to start with that because it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I'll start with what I do and then go right into the story, which explains why I do what I do. So founder and CEO, Martine Kalaw Enterprises, and what we do is we support human resources professionals in saving time, reducing the burden, and being able to drive return on investment, ROI, when it comes to everything related to DEI in the workplace, right? And what we also do is we support human resources with training, with consulting, as well as any speaking opportunities, and really helping them to understand that they're not the only ones that are responsible for DEI. It's a symbiotic relationship, primarily between human resources and managers in the workplace, right? Because when you think about the workforce and who shapes the makeup of the workforce and the longstanding of the workforce, it's really managers through performance management and human resources, right? So a little bit about my story and how I came, into this work. So my background is I'm a stateless and undocumented immigrant survivor. I was born, and I'm from Zambia and the Democratic Republic, respectively, have been in the US since I was 4 years old. And, after I was orphaned, by the time I was 15, I became undocumented. And I was placed in deportation proceedings, which is euphemistically called removal proceedings at this point, for 7 years, and didn't have a country to return to because I was stateless. So in the time that I was navigating these spaces or navigating and trying to survive in America on my own, I was exposed to different communities. I went to a predominantly white boarding school. I went to, as an African child, I also went to a predominantly African-American middle school. I, as an undocumented immigrant, I was exposed to communities of undocumented immigrants and stateless persons. And also when I was navigating my workplace, like as I worked, spent 13 years driving learning and development departments for different companies, people thought I was the girl next door. They would never, for whatever reason, imagine that I was at one time undocumented, that I was at one time stateless. So as a result, I feel like I have this privilege. I was given this opportunity to navigate all these different communities and different spaces and be a bridge builder, right? Because in these different communities, people have been entrusted me and sort of invited me in, right? Whether it was authentically or inauthentically, I've been invited into these spaces. And so I feel like I have an opportunity to build a bridge and connect these various communities and help people, shift their lens through a very disarming approach that I like to use. So this is why I do the work that I do around DEI in the workplace, because of the background I have, because of the exposure and my ability to understand and connect with different communities.
It's such a deep and profound calling. And I love the way you talk about it as an opportunity rather than a responsibility, because I think it is both of those things. We've talked on the show many times about how the two of us, really struggle with having privilege on one hand and then looking like we don't have privilege in other circumstances. So I love the way that you talk about it as an opportunity. But, that's what drives us. Susan has a daughter. I have a stepdaughter. I have, I'm a mentor to people in my industry. And I want to make sure that, the experience that they have, that if there's anything that they can learn from the way I've done it, good or bad, that it is something that is paying forward. But I want to focus on a little bit to the way you work with organizations, because, as we were chatting in the green room, I think that's the place where we're up against a little bit of this disconnect. I think we've come to a place in 2022 where nobody's arguing the need for DEI in some capacity in organizations, whether you're a startup, whether you're a global enterprise. But maybe talk to us a little bit about how do we move from, passion project to embedded function across an organization? And, what have you seen? What are some of the arguments or struggles sort of that you've had as you're getting organizational leadership and HR on that page?
Yeah. So in my observation and the work that I've done with different organizations is, sometimes it's coming from a good place. There are instances where people feel like they just have to do it, but sometimes it's coming from a good place. Like we want to shift our organization, but the challenge is who is targeted with that responsibility of shifting things. And it's oftentimes human resources, right? Or the equivalent, right? Some organizations call it the people team, talent and people, whatever it is, right? They're charged with that. And the challenge with that is our human resources professionals don't have the experience. Oftentimes, they're not equipped with the resources and they feel like it's a burden. Right. And then the other piece is you have to think about historically the relationship that human resources has in organizations. They're still vying for a seat at the table. So therefore, you're charging this group, this entity that already is vying for a seat at the table and already feels like they're burdened and doesn't have the skills and the capabilities to facilitate DEI. Now we're charging them with this this responsibility. So that's one of the challenges, right? And that's what my organization does, is to support these human resources professionals with train their trainers. I offer monthly free masterclass to get them started in these conversations. That's the first challenge. The second is also how we position DEI, right? We only look at it solely from the perspective of it's the right thing to do in organizations, right? And it's to create social impact. And that is important. Absolutely. It's so personal for many of us, for people in organizations. And I always hear people say, especially when I work with organizations, it's usually people from the marginalized groups that are the most impassioned, right? They're trying to drive DEI. Now, the problem with that is that nothing changes, right? We've got to get those who can have the most influence, those who have the most influence, to also be engaged in these discussions and engaged in change. And those who have the most influence in the workforce are the C-suite. And when we look at the majority, statistically, visually, at the majority of who's in the C-suite across organizations, it's predominantly white men. And when I speak to white men and I have these conversations, I guess they feel that I'm very disarming, because what they share with me is, Martine, I don't feel like I can say anything. I don't feel like I'm invited into the conversation. I feel like the effort around diversity, equity, and inclusion means that I might lose my job, right? I mean, this is real stuff. So if we're not inviting them into these conversations to demystify and unravel these ideas, these myths, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. Nothing changes. And the only way to get these individuals into the conversation, so it's not seen like as an extracurricular activity, is to make it a business imperative, to look at it and present DEI the same way we present all other business structures: sales, marketing, right? We think about product. All of those different entities and structures in our organization are tied to return on investment. This is how we need to approach DEI, right? We start with that so that we're all speaking the same language and the highest levels in the organization understand the impact of DEI and they're bought in. And then we can discuss and bring in the conversations around soft skills, right? So it's really about thinking about, how do we reshape our procedures around DEI, because we understand the impact on ROI. And then we can talk about how we also shape the practice. And that's through our managers and our human resources professionals who are reinforcing that for the managers.
Mm-hmm. I think you've said it really well there about just reshaping the narrative, the discussion, and making it clear that this is not philanthropy, right? I mean, and this is not something
extracurricular.
It isn't. It really isn't. And then I think some of the threat of the discussion comes away from it when you look at it in a slightly more math-oriented context, if you will, as well. And I think we wanted to dig a bit deeper into the idea of creating those safe spaces, because I'll tell you, we talk about allyship a fair bit as we have these discussions, and how is it that the people that we need as allies can come in and have those discussions. And I think, I see often self-deprecation. I see wanting to remove themselves from the discussion because what can I possibly contribute to it? And, what you are left with is a private party where we're all raving about how this is much needed without,
changes. Right.
Exactly. So with that said, to dig a little bit more into that, you've got the commitment, you potentially are like, okay, we're in a time in history where a business case has got to be made for it. How does that translate into the practice? Because as a digital marketer, I can tell you, I see these things which are like you say one thing and then a completely different, like even a form, for example, where you start about your great equity commitments on your values page, and then you go there and I've got Mr. and Mrs. as the only two options to put in the very first field of my outreach to you. you've failed a lot of people when you haven't translated it. So talk to us about your experience and how that's playing out.
Yeah. It's because, again, we're starting with, okay, what are we going to do? What are the programs, right? We immediately go through to programs. You start with the ROI. What is the return on investment? Like, that's the driving force. Identify it. If you're B2B, you're B2C. Where are we trying to go? What are our financial goals? All right. Well, then it's always a lot easier when you're thinking about business to consumer businesses. You think about, where do we have an opportunity? Do we have an opportunity to increase our market share? If the answer is yes, and usually the answer is always yes, well, then DEI plays a huge role, because it can influence how our, the market share that we're able to get access to. And that also, it has to start on the inside, right? So our salespeople cannot look one way and then we're trying to attract a different, market share, right? So that's always a great place to start. When it's business to business, again, it's all right. Who are our partners? Who do they service? And how do we connect with them? Right? How do we support our partners? Who do our partners look like? What do they look like? Do we reflect what our partners look like, or do we understand the different communities that they service, right? These are the questions that have to happen first, so that we can then identify, okay, this is a business imperative. This is important. This is going to change our revenue, right? Our revenue stream. So that's the first thing. Then we can start to actually look at the numbers. Then we actually have a reason to actually look at the metrics. And what I argue is that we look at metrics on a very one-dimensional scale. You look at metrics and you look at them at the cross section, right? So there's a difference in looking at, all right, how many, looking at ethnicity across the board, but there's a difference in looking at ethnicity and promotion. How many people are we promoting, and looking at age and ethnicity, or looking at ethnicity based on job levels, right? That tells a different story, right? So that's the next thing. So then once we understand that it's a business imperative, just like sales, just like all of this stuff, and this is how it's going to drive the business, and we actually have the numbers, which presents a baseline for us. Now we start to create the strategy. And one element of the strategy is working through our managers, right? And our managers get to be not passive allies, because I make a distinction between active allies and passive allies. We've got a whole lot of great passive allies in organizations that are wanting to do something and they're like, but I don't know what to do, right? So active allyship can be facilitated through manager and management development, right? Managers all need management development, right? So organizations, if you're listening and you don't have a management development program, then that is a huge disservice to your managers right there. So we know that managers automatically need to upskill themselves to be more effective in being managers. So what I'm suggesting is DEI just becomes a way to pivot, right? Management development. It's not changing it, right? That's why it's the ABCs. We make DEI so these like ethereal and it's so complex. So in my book, right, which I provide, it's a workbook. So at the end of every chapter, I actually provide practical application for managers, right? So an example of that would be, okay, if I'm talking about a chapter on hiring bias, what I would say, or what are the recommendations, is that managers, the next thing you can do, the next time you're going through the hiring process, what I'd like for you to do is look at all of the resumes and ask yourself, how are all these candidates the same? Just ask yourself that question, start. Then go back to talent acquisition and say, can I get a different pool? Can you provide me with a wider pool of candidates? Can we look at candidates that we haven't looked at before? Or reach out to your diversity task force or equivalent, or ERGs, and get recommendations from them in terms of a talent pool. Another example of creating equity, because equity is access. Managers, one of the things you can do is, what we know and what we've seen and what I've experienced personally is that Sometimes having access to senior leadership, having access to mentors in senior leadership has a lot to do with what happens outside of work, on the golf course. Now, I don't play golf. I don't know anything about golf. It's very unlikely that I'm going to be invited to the next golf game. So then how do I get access to senior leadership, to senior management, to be my mentor? How do I even know that I can approach this person, right? Because oftentimes when mentorship programs are not formal, and a lot of companies, they're not formal, it ends up being, a white boys club, right? And so what you can do is invite senior leadership to your next team meeting. Make sure that everyone gets to share. Everyone on your team gets exposure to senior management. So now everyone has access to senior management. Make sure that you share and you let everyone on your team, each person know that, hey, do you have a mentor? You should consider getting a mentor. And here are some opportunities and how you can navigate in getting a mentor. That's as simple as it can be, right? It can be pretty straightforward. Just doing that can create inclusion, can create more equity, right, in the workplace. So these are the little steps that we can take that seem little, but that can slowly change, right, the makeup of the organization. Another example could be performance appraisals, right? When we go through performance appraisals, that influences somebody's compensation, their ability, their trajectory in an organization. Are we actually, let's look at how we're measuring each person. Managers, when you write your performance appraisals for all your team members, go back and look at, are you rating them based on their personality or their performance, right? And perhaps get a second opinion, get their mentor, get their cross-functional manager, whoever they work with, to also look at and give input on a performance appraisal, right? These little things shape and help to undo bias, mitigate bias. They help to change the makeup of the organization. So these are small steps that we can take in management development practices that are actually, in effect, diversity, equity, and inclusion tools.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's so much I love about what you just said, but I think two things. One is, I think, breaking it down so that it doesn't seem like this insurmountable thing, right? I'm not asking you to guess the number in my head.
That's right.
Like, there are many numbers, there are many options. A lot of it rolls into common sense, empathy, kindness,
right,
rethinking. We've had this form for 20 years. Is it time to retire it? Is it time to, add some more things to it? Or can we stop saying that word because nobody knows what it means and it's kind of offensive? So I think it's a lot of it just comes down to sort of like, even, when people write and they read out loud and they're like, wow, I just said that word 4 times, right? You just have to be conscious about it rather than just reading it, thoughtlessly. So I think that piece of it, the accessibility of it, is so powerful. I think the other part of it is when it talks about, when we talk about performance management, we talk about building up teams, or we talk about getting to, higher standards, there's such a focus on raising the bar that sometimes I feel we do it at the cost of lowering the barrier, right? And they don't have to be opposite. Like, you can, by lowering the barrier to participation, you're actually raising the bar because you then have that many more people on the same wavelength. Like, right? Yeah, I'm not going into a meeting with a bunch of people who are 1 year into their careers and talking about supply chain disruptions and, and trade sanctions. I'm going to say, okay, so, when you order furniture and you don't get it for 8 months, that goes back to here's the causes of it, right? So it is about making it accessible for everybody, whether you're a C-suite who, who didn't have to deal with some of these issues as they were moving up in their career, or you're talking to people who are 1 or 2 years into their career, or perhaps just haven't had this experience, right? Are committed to in some way. So I really like the accessibility of it, but more importantly, the connection back to performance and, core function.
Yeah. And, I remember leading a workshop with managers on microaggressions, and, it went really well. But I had one manager who said, Martine, this is so overwhelming. Like, I'm not going to know all the different microaggressions, and I don't necessarily agree that they're microaggressions, and I don't know how to deal with this. I'm overwhelmed. And I said, just relax here. Outside of microaggressions, when you have someone, a direct report, someone on your team come to you and they're frustrated with something, or they're not, they have an issue, what do? I coach them. Well, then take the same approach with microaggression, right? When it comes to microaggressions, just like if a person comes to you with any other issue, it's not about you. It's not your decision, your choice to decide whether you agree or disagree. Your choice is to understand where they're coming from and find a way to move forward, help them find a solution and be part of the solution with them, right? That's really what it takes. And so it's the same processes, it's the same skills that we automatically learn as managers that we also can apply when it comes to DEI, right? It's just shifting it a little bit, shifting the lens just a little bit. And that's really why it's the ABCs of diversity.
Yep. Clearly I could not agree more. The name of this podcast comes from much of that same place. I don't think we even intended for it to face the workplace. I think we intended it to be a start of a conversation. And it just felt like with us spending such monumental amounts of time in the workplace, and the fact that for many of us, hybrid is just probably going to be the way it is. I think this discussion just needs to be had. And, the time that you've spent talking about that is I'm grateful. Thank you for breaking that down in that way. So Martine, in terms of like at the end of each episode, we like to just say at this moment in history to sort of summarize it and be like, if there's a couple of things you can do right away, what might those be? And bearing in mind that we're recording this at the start of Black History Month. And for the next little while, everyone's going to jump on this bandwagon and be a part of it. And how do you sort of center that lived experience beyond 1 month? How can we take that away from this?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I get organizations who reached out to me, hey, can you come in and talk about Black History Month, be our speaker? And I think they, what I say to them, and when I come in and I do these talks and I say, as organizations right now, some of us are trying to make these grand gestures around Black History Month. We're going out there, right? Looking at all the historical people that, Black people in America who influenced and shaped our culture, who shaped our history, right? But why don't we start internally? Let's start with our organizations. Look at the makeup of the people in your organization. Look at the makeup of Black people in your company. Look at their career trajectory. Look at, their attrition levels. Start there. Start in your house rather than going outside. Like, that's the grandest gesture that you can make, right? And so therefore, it's not just about 1 month. And why that's important is because what we know is that when we look at, statistics show, among all of the different, racial categories in America, in the workforce, Black people experience 58% more racism in the workplace, right? And so what we know and what, studies show is that when you tackle the group that has experienced the greatest burden for the longest amount of time historically, right? What you do is you support every other group, you uplift everyone else that comes after, right? And so that is why it's important to start with Black History Month, but it doesn't mean that Black History Month and Black people are the only groups that are going to be affected by, by change and by, equity and inclusion practices. But it's important to start there rather than starting outside of there and, trying to acknowledge and commemorate all of these other people, commemorate the people in your organization, right? So that's really what I like to say. And that's usually, the approach I like to take. Start in-house, start at home, right? And that's the best way that you can actually affect and commemorate Black History Month.
I love that. Wise words. Thank you so much. Thank you for spending this time with us. I know we are richer for it. So thank you.
You're so welcome. And I would love to just have one call to action, right? I encourage everyone, especially if you're HR, manager, HR, provider, to go to my website, martinekalaw.com, and sign up for my next masterclass. It's complimentary. It's March 3rd. Yes, March 3rd. And what we do is we're going to talk about 5 elements, like the 5 key elements that you can use to actually start to affect DEI in your workplace. And one of them, I'll just give away one, is creating a DEI playbook. Right. I really am a big believer, just like we have sales playbooks, right, to really affect change and have strategy. Let's start building out a DEI playbook. Right. So we'll talk about the other 4 elements that you can use to start really moving DEI along. Right. And we want to empower you with the tools and the resources to do so.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm a big fan of things that are documented. If there's a playbook, you're going to get it done. So,
yeah. And everyone knows the term playbook is much more familiar, right? It's a common language throughout an organization. So let's use it. Let's repurpose it.
Love it. Beautiful. Thank you, Martine.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to hit subscribe and please drop us a review. If you want to learn more about us or the ABCDEI podcast, visit abcdei.ca.